There is a document that the New Zealand psychiatric system would prefer had never been found. A single typed form, yellowed at the edges, bearing the date of what should have been the last morning of Janet Frame's mind. The form had been completed in careful bureaucratic handwriting, reviewed by senior staff, and signed with the quiet authority of institutional medicine. The operating room had been reserved. The surgical instruments had been prepared. The surgeon had received his briefing. And the woman lying in the ward at Sunnyside Hospital in the city of Christchurch, the woman who would one day be called the greatest writer New Zealand ever produced, had absolutely no idea what was about to be done to her brain, or that anything more was being done to her at all. She was 29 years old. She had spent the better part of a decade inside psychiatric institutions, passing through their locked wards and treatment rooms with the helpless patience of someone who has been told so many times and by so many people in positions of authority that the judgments being made about her are correct, and that her own sense of herself as a coherent and perceptive person is itself a symptom of the disorder they are attempting to cure. She had received, by the time that surgical form was signed, over 200 sessions of electroconvulsive therapy, 200 applications of electrical current to her brain, administered without adequate anesthetic in the early years, while she was held down on a treatment table by hospital staff. 200 sessions that had left her each time unable to remember where she was, who she was, what decade she was living in. The self repeatedly and systematically taken apart and left to reassemble itself in whatever form emerged from the fog of the aftermath. And now the form had been signed, and the date was set, and a procedure more permanent than any electroconvulsive session was being prepared. A leucotomy, a lobotomy as the popular press called it, a surgical severing of the connections between the frontal lobe and the deeper structures of the brain, a procedure that would, according to its proponents, reduce the distressing intensity of her interior life to something more manageable, more suitable for the world that could not accommodate what she was. The procedure was scheduled. The operating room was waiting, and Janet Frame did not know.
But on the morning before the surgery, something happened that would later be described as one of the most extraordinary coincidences in the history of New Zealand literature. A newspaper arrived at the hospital, as it did every morning. A staff member brought it to the ward. In that newspaper was a small announcement, the kind of item that runs in a few column inches and is easily passed over by anyone not looking for it. The announcement reported that the Hubert Church Memorial Award, the most prestigious prize in New Zealand for a debut work of prose fiction, had been awarded to a collection of short stories called The Lagoon, written by a patient in a New Zealand psychiatric hospital named Janet Frame. The superintendent of the hospital read this announcement. He set down his coffee. He walked to the ward. He spoke with the surgical staff. And he said, in words that Janet Frame herself would record in her autobiography 3 decades later, that it would not be right to proceed with the surgery on someone who had just won a major literary prize. It would not be right. Those were his exact words. After nearly a decade of electroconvulsive therapy, after a diagnosis entered into a file without adequate clinical evidence, after the slow and systematic removal of Janet Frame's freedom, her context, her daily life, her access to a world that had continued without her, it would not be right. A literary prize in a morning newspaper was what stood between the knife and Janet Frame's brain. Not a doctor finally looking at the evidence, not a nurse raising an alarm, not a family member demanding review. A prize. That was the margin. The question this story asks is not only what was saved on that particular morning. The question is what had already been spent in the years that led to it, what it cost, and whether the people who spent it ever understood the nature of the account they were running. Because for every Janet Frame, there was a woman whose newspaper never arrived. And their names are not in this story, because history decided they were not worth finding. She was born on the 28th of August, 1924, in the harbour city of Dunedin, at the southern tip of New Zealand's South Island. Dunedin sits at the edge of the world in a way that is more than metaphorical. A Victorian city built by Scottish settlers on a peninsula at the bottom of the Pacific, so distant from the literary and intellectual centers of the English-speaking world that even its most educated residents sometimes felt they were conducting their inner lives at a significant and unbridgeable remove from wherever the important conversations were happening. Her father, George Samuel Frame, drove locomotives for the New Zealand government railways. Her mother, Lottie, was a woman of deep interior life who recited poetry around the house with the ease of someone for whom language was not a formality, but a daily necessity. Tennyson and Browning and Burns in the kitchen of a railway cottage on a wet South Island afternoon. The family lived in the particular intimacy of poverty and frequent relocation, following the railway work as it moved, settling eventually in the small East Coast town of Oamaru, where the Frame children grew up with the smell of the sea in everything and the constant gentle pressure of financial constraint shaping every decision. There were 5 children. For the middle child, for Janet, the world inside her head was always more real, more detailed, more intensely inhabited than the world visible to other people. She wrote poems on scraps of paper and hid them in the springs of her mattress, as though even the act of keeping them was something that needed to be concealed from a world that might not understand their value. She read everything available in the Oamaru Public Library, working through the shelves with the systematic thoroughness of someone who believes that somewhere in those stacks there was an answer to a question she has not yet fully articulated. The adults around her reached for words like sensitive and peculiar and difficult when they tried to describe her. What they meant, without knowing precisely how to say it, was that the gap between what Janet Frame appeared to feel and what other people appeared to feel was wider than was comfortable. She observed the world around her, the neighbors, the social codes of the town, the small ceremonies of approval and disapproval by which communities regulate their members, with an attention so precise and so unsparing that it sometimes seemed less like ordinary perception and more like the focused gaze of someone who was always quietly taking notes for a purpose not yet defined.
But grief came before any formal judgment could be reached about this quality of attention. It came on a summer afternoon in 1937, when Janet was 12 years old and the Frame family was swimming at the Oamaru public baths. Her sister Myrtle, who was 16 and whose laughter Janet had been hearing all her life, slipped beneath the water without warning and did not come back up. She drowned there, in the public baths of the small town where they had grown up, while the afternoon continued around the edges of the catastrophe with the ordinary indifference of time. The loss was foundational, not the ordinary grief of bereavement, though it was that, but something that altered the structure of the world, that demonstrated with a clarity no 12-year-old can fully absorb or recover from, that the people you love can simply be taken, without negotiation, without appeal to reason or justice or mercy. Janet Frame carried this knowledge into every sentence she subsequently wrote. You can find it on almost every page of everything she produced. The awareness that beauty and loss are inseparable, that the act of paying attention to what you love is always simultaneously an act of preparation for its absence. It was not a morbid knowledge, it was an honest one, and it was the beginning of a writer. She trained as a teacher at Dunedin Teachers College in the early years of the 1940s. Teaching was among the few professional paths available to intelligent young women of limited means in New Zealand at that time, and she took to the academic components of the training with the discipline that characterized everything she applied herself to. But the social components, the performance of authority before a class, the management of other people's expectations, the institutional routines that required a consistent public persona, presented difficulties that grew worse under pressure rather than better with practice. The anxiety that had always inhabited her solar plexus grew particularly acute in the presence of formal evaluation. And in February of 1945, the morning of a government school inspection, the day when an inspector would observe her class and determine her professional future, the anxiety became too large to manage, and Janet Frame walked into the headmistress's office and said quietly that she could not continue with the inspection. She was referred to a doctor.
The doctor referred her to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist referred her, on the 2nd of August 1945, to Seacliff Lunatic Asylum on the hillside outside Dunedin, a Victorian Gothic institution that resembled, both architecturally and operationally, a building from another century. She was 20 years old. She was not psychotic. She was not violent. She was not dangerous to herself or anyone else. She was intensely anxious, profoundly introverted, and possessed of a sensitivity so acute it had become, in the diagnostic vocabulary of the era, a disorder requiring management. The diagnosis entered into her file was schizophrenia. It was not correct. It was not based on a comprehensive assessment. It did not reflect the clinical presentation of schizophrenia as understood even then. It was a label, applied at a moment of acute distress to someone who had never exhibited schizophrenia's cardinal symptoms and would never exhibit them in the subsequent 6 decades of her life. It was written into a file. The file accumulated institutional momentum, and the label became, in the machinery of the system, self-confirming. Not because subsequent evidence supported it, but because the system had no mechanism for questioning its own certainties once they had been recorded in a file. It would take another 8 years and the intervention of a literary prize to produce the first serious challenge to that file. Inside the wards of Seacliff, and later Sunnyside, the women who shared those years with Janet Frame experienced a system whose defining institutional characteristic was the negation of the patient's own account of herself. What you felt was not what you felt, but a symptom of what was wrong with you. What you said was not what you meant, but evidence of the disorder requiring treatment. The interior life, the precise and richly inhabited inner world that was, for Janet Frame, the source of everything she would eventually produce, was exactly what the institution was designed to manage and reduce. The electroconvulsive therapy was the most visible instrument of this management, but it was not the only one. There was the insulin coma therapy, in which patients were injected with insulin until they lost consciousness, a process believed, on the basis of theory rather than evidence, to reset the disordered chemistry of the schizophrenic brain. There was the long-term chemical sedation.
There was the institutional routine itself, with its enforced rhythms of sleeping and waking and eating and treatment, which gradually displaced the patient's own interior rhythms with the institution's, until the distinction between the two became difficult to hold on to. Janet Frame received this treatment, the full range of it, across the full length of her years inside, with the helpless submission of someone who has no legal standing, no independent advocate, and no formal mechanism for challenging the judgments of the people who hold authority over her. And alongside the treatments, she wrote, in whatever quiet hours were available, short stories, fragments, the beginnings of a voice that would eventually find its full power, but which was already, even in those constrained conditions, unmistakably itself. In 1947, she was briefly discharged. She lived outside the institution for a time and experienced the world with the heightened strangeness of someone re-entering ordinary life from a place that had operated by entirely different rules. And then, in the summer of 1947, her younger sister June drowned in the Oamaru public swimming baths, the same water where Myrtle had drowned 10 years before. 2 sisters, the same town, the same impossible chance. She returned to the institution. The diagnosis was reinforced by the crisis. The file grew thicker. And somewhere in the administrative structure of the hospital, a decision was slowly being assembled about what to do with a patient who had not responded to treatment in the way treatment was supposed to produce. What the doctors could not account for, what the file did not and could not contain, was the quality of the person they were discussing in its pages. The file showed a schizophrenic patient who had not adequately responded to electroconvulsive therapy and required a more definitive intervention. The person in the ward was something else entirely. She was someone who had spent 8 years watching and remembering, who had developed, in the constrained conditions of institutional life, an interior discipline and a precision of observation that were building, slowly and invisibly to everyone around her, towards something the institution could not name and would not have recognized if it had. There was one person from outside who understood what was in that ward.
His name was Charles Brash, and he was the editor of Landfall, at that time the most serious literary publication in New Zealand. Through the quiet networks of a small but genuine literary community, Brash had become aware of a manuscript, a collection of short stories produced by a psychiatric patient that had been circulating among people with the capacity to recognize what it was. He had read the stories himself. He had understood, with the intelligence of a careful reader encountering something genuinely unlike anything that had come before it, what he was holding. He had arranged for the manuscript to be submitted to a publisher. The publisher had accepted it. In late 1951, the collection had appeared under the title The Lagoon,
It received warm critical notices. It was submitted for the Hubert Church Memorial Award. And on a particular morning in a hospital in Christchurch, a newspaper carrying the announcement of that award had arrived in the ward, and the superintendent had read it, and the surgery had been cancelled. The person who opened the next door for Janet Frame was Frank Sargison, at that time the most respected prose writer in New Zealand, a bachelor in his late 40s who lived in a modest house in the Auckland suburb of Takapuna. In the garden behind the house was a small tin-roofed shed he used as a writing studio. He had read The Lagoon. He had recognized, with the particular clarity of a serious writer encountering a talent greater than his own, that what had been produced in those hospital wards was extraordinary. And when he learned the outline of what had been done to the woman who wrote it, he made an offer. He wrote to Janet Frame and invited her to come to Auckland. The shed in his garden was available to her as a place to live and write. He asked nothing except that she use the time. She arrived in Takapuna in the early months of 1955. She was 30 years old. She moved into the shed, which was barely large enough to stand up in, and she began writing the novel that would become Owls Do Cry. Sargison kept a careful, respectful distance. He provided food, he maintained the quiet of the garden, and he occasionally read the pages she left for him. He did not ask questions. He did not impose timelines or expectations.
He understood, from his own experience of the particular demands of serious writing, that what Janet Frame needed was not direction, but space, the most fundamental and the most consistently denied thing in her life to that point. The neighbors who occasionally glimpsed her described a woman who was intensely private and intensely present, who moved through the garden with a quality of attention suggesting she was always, even in the simplest physical acts, registering more than was visible to ordinary perception. She was not easy company in any conventional sense. She did not fill silences. She did not make the social overtures that facilitate comfortable human interaction. But the people who encountered her in those months felt afterward that they had been in the presence of something they could not quite name, a quality of aliveness, of complete immersion in the experience of being alive, that was both compelling and slightly vertiginous. Sargison made inquiries about the history of her diagnosis. The information that returned to him was disturbing. The original assessment at Seacliff had been inadequate. It had not been reviewed in the years since. The file had simply accumulated, each subsequent hospitalization adding its weight to the initial judgment, until the diagnosis had become self-confirming, maintained not by evidence, but by institutional momentum. He shared his concerns with the people he trusted in the literary and medical communities. The response he received confirmed what he suspected. The manuscript grew in the shed. The novel took its shape. And Sargison, reading the pages Janet occasionally shared with him, understood with increasing certainty that he was witnessing the recovery of something the institution had spent nearly a decade attempting to destroy, and that had survived in spite of everything, not because of anything the system had done, but because of the extraordinary and indestructible particularity of the mind that had endured it. When scholarship funds assembled by sympathetic figures in the literary world were ready, Janet Frame sailed for England. She was 32 years old. She had never left New Zealand before. As the ship crossed the Tasman Sea and turned north, and the distance between herself and Seacliff lengthened with every watch, she felt something she would later describe as the first genuine breath of freedom she had taken in over a decade. She worked in London as a cleaner while she wrote.
She moved to Ibiza. She returned to London. She produced work at a pace suggesting that she understood in the most bodily and direct way that the time available to her was not guaranteed, that it had very nearly not been available at all, and that every page was a page that a signed form in a Christchurch hospital had almost made impossible. In London, she sought out a psychiatrist affiliated with the Maudsley Hospital. She described her history. The doctor reviewed what records she could access. He told her, in plain and deliberate language, that the schizophrenia diagnosis was not supported by any clinical evidence he could identify in what she had presented to him. She was not and had not been schizophrenic. The 8 years of electroconvulsive therapy, the institutional confinement, the nearly performed lobotomy, all of it had been applied to a person who did not have the condition it was supposedly treating. He said this in 1957. It was the first time a doctor had said it without qualification or hedging.
She received this information with the composure that those who knew her consistently remarked upon, a composure that was not indifference, but something harder won, the equanimity of someone who has spent years learning to hold very difficult truths without being destroyed by them. She thanked him. She walked out of the hospital into the grey London afternoon. She stood on the pavement for some minutes. Then she walked back to her lodgings and sat down at her desk and continued writing. The London years produced 3 novels and the beginning of an international literary reputation. But the book that would change everything, the one that was less a novel than an act of witness that the world could not look away from, was published in 1961. Faces in the Water was, in all but the thinnest fictional covering, a direct account of what Janet Frame had seen and experienced and endured in the wards of Seacliff and Sunnyside. She described the wards without melodrama. She described the treatments with a precision that made them more disturbing than any sensationalized account could have been. She described the women around her, their specific fears and particular histories, the small economies of survival inside the institution, the way the system's version of a person gradually displaced the person's own version until the two became almost indistinguishable.
She described the electroconvulsive therapy from the inside, not its drama, but its routine, its administrative normality, the way it was scheduled and recorded and administered, as though it were an unremarkable clinical procedure, rather than the repeated temporary destruction of a person's capacity to know who she was. New Zealand received the book with a combination of genuine admiration and profound institutional discomfort. Literary critics praised it without reservation. Certain newspapers reviewed it with a careful neutrality that communicated, in the spaces between the praise, the depth of a discomfort that did not know how to express itself publicly. And from the psychiatric establishment, the institutions, the doctors, the administrators who knew exactly what the book described and who in their own careers had authorized treatments identical to those it depicted, there was almost no public response at all. The silence was strategic. It had been, according to sources in the medical history of the period, agreed upon in meetings among senior figures in the psychiatric establishment in the months following the book's publication. Not meetings called to examine what had been done and consider what was owed to the people it had been done to. Rather, meetings to determine how the institution's reputation could be managed in the face of a widely read and widely discussed account that described its practices with terrible and accurate clarity. The strategy agreed upon was the one institutions typically reach for when they cannot deny and will not acknowledge. They would say nothing. The discomfort would diminish, the files would remain closed. It was a strategy that proved in the short term entirely successful. The years passed. New Zealand's literary culture continued its complicated relationship with Janet Frame, admiring her achievement, honoring her with prizes and honorary degrees, and maintaining alongside all of this the peculiar guilt of a country that had done something to one of its greatest citizens that it was not prepared to formally acknowledge. But there was something the strategy could not account for. It could not account for the autobiography. In the late 1970s, Janet Frame began writing the 3 volumes that would be published under the titles To the Eastland, An Angel at My Table, and The Envoy from Mirror City.
She worked on these books with the full discipline and unflinching attention she brought to everything, but with an additional quality, a quality of reckoning, of gathering the whole shape of a life into a form that could be looked at clearly. She named the institutions, she described the treatments, she recorded the experience of the electroconvulsive therapy from the inside, and the near lobotomy, and the newspaper, and the superintendent's words, with the precision of someone who has been holding a particular memory for 30 years and has finally found the exactly right vessel for it. The tone of the autobiography is not primarily angry. It is sorrowful, and it is precise, and it is possessed of the quiet and unflinching quality of someone who has decided that the truth is more important than anyone's comfort, including her own. There is something in it that is ultimately more powerful than anger, the patient, careful recording of exactly what happened, in exactly the order it happened, with all the institutional names intact. This kind of testimony does not permit the reader to look away. New Zealand received the autobiography with admiration, institutional silence, and the complex and unresolved guilt of a country confronting in print and in public something it had preferred to keep in the files. The answer to the question of whether the country would look came from a direction no one had anticipated.
Jane Campion was 36 years old when she began working on the film adaptation of Janet Frame's autobiography. She was a New Zealander herself, born in Wellington, already recognized internationally as one of the most formally inventive filmmakers working in the English language. She had read the 3 volumes of Autobiography and had experienced, with the recognition that major artists feel when they encounter major material, the understanding that this story needed the additional dimension of the moving image. She approached it with seriousness and reverence. She made An Angel at My Table on a modest budget, with largely unknown actors, in New Zealand and in London and Spain. When the film was released in 1990, it went around the world. International critics who had never heard of Janet Frame encountered her story for the first time through Campion's filmmaking and were overwhelmed. Review after review used the word important.
Review after review noted that this was not merely an extraordinary film about an extraordinary woman, but a story that illuminated something essential about how societies manage the people they cannot accommodate, how the same sensitivity that produces genius can, in the wrong institutional context, be classified as disease and treated accordingly. In New Zealand, the reaction was more complicated. There was genuine pride in the international recognition. There was also, in the spaces between the public praise, the particular discomfort of a society recognizing on screen something it had preferred not to look at directly. No institution stepped forward. No medical body issued a statement of accountability. The signed form remained in its archive. The silence of the 1960s, now 30 years old, maintained itself at a slightly higher temperature. Janet Frame received the film and its international recognition from her house in Dunedin, the city of her birth, where she had lived for years with the quiet and solitude she had spent her adult life carefully constructing. She was 65 years old. She had published 12 novels, 3 volumes of autobiography, poetry, short stories. She had been made a companion of the New Zealand Order of Merit. She was, without any meaningful dispute, the greatest prose writer her country had produced. She kept writing. She returned the focus to the page, as she always had. In the early months of 2004, Janet Frame was diagnosed with leukemia. She was 79 years old. The illness was swift. She returned to hospital, the institution she had spent her life escaping, and that received her back, as institutions do, at the end. Friends who visited her in those final weeks described a woman who was clear and present, who asked about the work of the people she cared about, who answered questions about her own condition with the direct and undeflected honesty that was characteristic of everything she had ever said or written. She said, on one of the last occasions she spoke at length, that she had no regrets about the life she had lived. Not because it had been easy, not because the things done to her had been acceptable. They had been manifestly unacceptable, and she had spent her life saying so, but because the writing had been possible.
Because the shed in Sargison's garden, and the years abroad, and the small houses in Dunedin had given her enough time and enough silence to put down on paper what she needed to put down. Because the story she had been given was, despite everything, a story worth telling. On the 29th of January 2004, Janet Patterson Frame died at Dunedin Hospital. She was 79 years old. The tributes were genuine and extensive. Politicians spoke. Literary figures in New Zealand and abroad acknowledged an extraordinary career. Every obituary mentioned the Hubert Church Memorial Award, the newspaper, the cancelled surgery. The story was told again in each of them, always with the same note of barely suppressed disbelief at the margin by which it had all been decided. No psychiatric institution issued a formal statement. No medical body acknowledged what its predecessors had done. The women who had shared those wards with Janet Frame and were still alive to read the obituaries read them in the same silence that had surrounded them for 50 years. What was saved on that morning in Christchurch when the superintendent walked to the ward with a newspaper in his hand? The entire body of work, 12 novels, 3 volumes of autobiography, poetry, short stories, a voice that told us something true about what it costs to be different in a world that has decided what difference means. Faces in the Water was saved. To the Island was saved. The extraordinary interior world she built, with discipline and courage and the irreducible force of her own particularity, from the materials the institution provided, the wrong diagnosis, the locked wards, the 200 electroconvulsive sessions, the signed form, all of it was saved and transformed
and given back to the world as literature. But the question that haunts every page she ever wrote, the one she was too honest to answer and too honest to stop asking, is not about what was saved. It is about what was lost. Not from Janet Frame, whose genius survived everything they could do to it, but from the women beside her in those wards, who had no literary prize in any newspaper, who have no names in this account, because history did not find them worth recording. They were there. They received the same diagnoses and the same treatments and the same systematic management of whatever quality had made them inconvenient to the world around them.
And for them, no superintendent walked down a corridor with a newspaper. For them, the form was not canceled. For them, the procedure went ahead, as scheduled, as planned, as right. The small tin-roofed shed in Frank Sargison's garden is no longer standing. The Victorian Gothic buildings of Seacliff Asylum have been largely demolished. The signed form is filed somewhere in an archive, carefully preserved, in a room where the documents are maintained with a thoroughness and a care that was never extended to the people they described. But the books remain. And in the books, the question remains, patient and permanent and entirely unanswered. How many others were in those wards who should not have been there, and who is counting them now? The town of Oamaru in the 1920s and 30s was the kind of place that left a permanent mark on the people who grew up in it, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was so thoroughly ordinary, so comprehensively committed to a particular version of what a person was supposed to be and do and feel. It was a limestone town, with grand Victorian public buildings and narrow domestic streets. A town that had once believed it would become a significant commercial center, and had learned, over several generations, to live with a quieter destiny. The social codes were precise and well-maintained. You knew your neighbors. You knew what was expected of you. You knew from early childhood the difference between what was acceptable and what was not, and you arranged yourself accordingly. For most of the Frame children, this arrangement was possible. They were poor and were sometimes hungry, and they moved often, but they were also embedded in the social world of the town in ways that gave them footing. They went to school. They had friends. They participated, at least functionally, in the performance of ordinary social life that Oamaru required. For Janet, the performance was always slightly beyond reach. She understood what was required. She could see the social choreography being executed around her with perfect clarity, but she could not quite execute it herself, could not quite make herself present in the easy, unreflective way that social participation requires, because the act of watching and understanding the choreography was itself an interference with the ability to perform it.
She was, in the most precise sense, a writer before she wrote anything. A person who could not be in the world without simultaneously being the person watching herself be in the world, and watching the world watching her, in an infinite regression of observation that made ordinary, unself-conscious participation impossible. The poetry she wrote in those years, and hid in her mattress, was not precious or derivative. It was the work of a 12-year-old, and then a 14-year-old, who had found in language the one medium that could accommodate the fullness of what she felt and saw. The poems were her way of placing the world at a slight distance, of converting the raw, overwhelming intensity of her perceptions into something that could be looked at, handled, given a shape. The hiding was also instructive. She understood, without needing to be told, that this kind of inner life was not something Oamaru would welcome. You kept it to yourself. You maintained the surface. You performed the social expectations as well as you could manage, and you kept the rest behind the mattress. This was a strategy that many sensitive and unconventional people of her generation employed, and for most of them, it worked well enough. For Janet Frame, it worked until the afternoon of the school inspection, and then it stopped working, and the consequences of that failure would shape the next decade of her life. The referral from the doctor to the psychiatrist to the asylum was not, in the New Zealand of 1945, an unusual sequence of events. The country's psychiatric system was at that point in the full confidence of its mid-century expansion. New wards, new treatments, new diagnostic categories,
The whole elaborate machinery of institutional psychiatry operating in the sincere belief that it was identifying and treating conditions that previous generations had simply endured without understanding. The doctors who signed the forms and administered the treatments were not, for the most part, sadists or cynics. They were practitioners operating within the professional consensus of their time, applying the tools available to them to the problems as those problems had been defined by their training. The problem with Janet Frame was defined by her admission at a moment of acute anxiety and by the diagnostic category that was applied to her in the first hours of that admission.
Schizophrenia was, in the 1940s, a diagnosis applied with considerably less precision than the clinical science of the era would, in retrospect, have required. It was, in many institutions, a residual category, applied when the presentation was unusual, the patient was resistant to easy categorization, or the examiner was under time pressure and needed a label for the file. Once applied, it was very difficult to remove. The institutional logic of the asylum did not have robust mechanisms for reconsidering its own conclusions, particularly when the patient being assessed had no independent advocate and no legal standing to challenge the judgment. What the diagnosis of schizophrenia meant in practice at Seacliff in the mid-1940s was the electroconvulsive therapy. This was the standard treatment for the condition as understood at the time, and it was applied with the regularity and routine that institutional medicine brings to its standard procedures. The therapy was given on a schedule. The schedule was maintained. The patient was brought to the treatment room when her turn came, and the treatment was administered, and she was returned to the ward. The file noted the treatment. The file noted her response. The file grew. What the file could not capture, what the diagnostic categories available to the examining doctors in 1945 were constitutionally unable to capture, was the interior world that the treatments were being applied to. They could not capture the precise and detailed observation. They could not capture the sentences already forming, even then, in the disciplined silence of a mind that had learned to keep its most important work hidden. They could not capture the extraordinary quality of attention that would eventually produce some of the most singular prose in the English language. They could only note, in the clinical shorthand available to them, that the patient had not responded to treatment as expected, and that the treatment should therefore continue and be intensified. 200 sessions. It is a number that requires contemplation. 200 separate occasions on which Janet Frame was brought to a treatment room, held down, fitted with a rubber bit, and subjected to an electrical current sufficient to produce a grand mal seizure. 200 separate occasions of waking in confusion, unable to remember where she was. 200 separate occasions of reassembling herself from the fragments of consciousness that remained after the current had done its work. The cumulative effect on memory, on the coherence of autobiographical experience, on the basic infrastructure of selfhood, was profound. That she maintained the interior discipline to continue writing throughout this period is one of the most remarkable facts in the history of literature. She wrote because she had to, because the writing was, by that point, not a choice but a necessity, the only thing that reliably convinced her of her own continued existence as a coherent person. Each sentence she put on paper was evidence that she was still there, still capable of the precise and demanding work of transforming experience into language. The writing was survival, in the most direct and literal sense. And the institution, which was ostensibly treating her, could not see this, could not see in the pages she covered with her precise handwriting during the hours between treatments anything other than the further evidence of a disordered mind that needed more treatment. The near lobotomy was not, in the context of the era, an aberration. Leucotomies were being performed routinely in psychiatric institutions throughout the English-speaking world in the early 1950s, on the basis of a theory of schizophrenia that understood the condition as an excess of inner experience, too much feeling, too much intensity, too much of the very qualities that, in a different context and with a different diagnostic framework, would have been identified as gifts rather than pathologies. The procedure reduced this excess. It rendered the patient calmer, less distressed, more manageable. It also, in many cases, reduced the patient to a shadow of the person who had been admitted, someone who could perform the basic functions of daily life, but who no longer had access to whatever it had been that made them specifically and irreducibly themselves. This was considered by the medical consensus of the time an acceptable outcome.
The distress had been alleviated. The patient was stable. The ward had one less difficult case. The fact that what had been removed, along with the distress, was the person, that the absence of suffering had been achieved by the absence of the sufferer, was not, within the clinical framework available, a result that required acknowledgement or grief.
For Janet Frame, the intervention of a newspaper changed everything. But the intervention was not, it must be said, designed. It was not the product of a system that had finally looked at its own practices and found them wanting. It was not the result of an advocate or a lawyer or a family member demanding review. It was an accident of timing, the chance coincidence of a literary prize announcement and a superintendent who read the morning newspaper before he walked to the operating wing. It was luck, in the most raw and unadorned sense of the word. Frank Sargison understood this. When he made his offer of the shed in Takapuna, he was not performing a charitable act in any conventional sense. He was making a bet, a large, risky, carefully considered bet, on the possibility that the person who had written The Lagoon was still intact enough, after everything, to produce the work that her talent warranted. He was betting that the damage done by Seacliff and Sunnyside was not irreversible, that the self that had survived 200 sessions of electroconvulsive therapy and a near lobotomy was the same self that had written those extraordinary short stories, that given space and silence and time, it would produce what it was capable of producing. He was right. And the rightness of his bet, the fact that the self was indeed intact, that it had preserved through everything the quality of attention and the capacity for language that made it what it was, is the most astonishing single fact in this entire story. More astonishing than the newspaper, more astonishing than the canceled surgery. The fact that Janet Frame, after 8 years and 200 treatments, was still entirely herself. The months in Takapuna and then the years abroad were not easy. Freedom, after so long inside institutional walls, is its own kind of difficulty. The absence of the structure that had defined every waking hour, the scheduled treatments, the ward routines, the institutional rhythms that had replaced her own, left a space that she had to learn, again, to fill. She was 30 years old. She had spent most of her adult life inside a system that had made all the decisions about how her days were organized. Learning to organize them herself, learning to trust the rhythms of her own working life, learning to believe that the time was hers and would remain hers, this was a work as demanding as any of the writing.
She managed it because she had no alternative, and because the writing itself was the evidence, day by day and page by page, that the management was possible. Each completed page was proof that she was capable of this life. Each published chapter was a further extension of the margin between herself and the institution. Each novel, received by readers who understood what it was doing, was a confirmation that the Hubert Church Award had not been mistaken, that the talent was real, that it had survived, that it was producing what the world needed from it. The London psychiatrist's confirmation in 1957 was important not because it changed anything practically. It did not restore the 8 years, it did not provide accountability, it did not open any institutional door, but because it changed something internally. The knowledge that the diagnosis had been wrong, stated plainly by a doctor with no institutional interest in the question, gave Janet Frame something she had not fully had before, the external confirmation of what she had always known about herself, that she was not, and had never been, broken, that the institution's version of her, the schizophrenic patient who required management, was not a true account, that her own version, the writer, the observer, the person in possession of a particular and irreplaceable interior world, was the accurate one. This knowledge did not make her angry primarily. It made her, if anything, more determined, more clear about what the writing was for, more certain that the witness she was bearing, to her own experience and to the experiences of the women who had been in those wards around her, was a witness that needed to be borne as completely and as precisely as she was capable of bearing it. Faces in the Water was the first full expression of this determination. The book's reception, the admiration in literary circles, the silence from the institutions, the careful neutrality of certain newspapers, confirmed for her something she had suspected, that the truth she was telling was true in a way that created discomfort for people who had reasons to prefer a different account.
and that their discomfort was not, in itself, a reason to soften the telling. The 3 volumes of autobiography were the final and fullest expression of it. By the time she began writing To the Island in the late 1970s, she had been out of the institutions for over 2 decades.
She had a body of work behind her that established her as a serious and major literary presence. She had the distance of years and the clarity of retrospect. And she had, perhaps most importantly, the understanding, hard-won and carefully maintained, that the story she was about to tell in full was not only her own story, but a representative one. That what had happened to her had happened to many others. That the institutional silence which had surrounded those others was a silence she was, by writing, breaking. The autobiography was not written as an act of revenge. It was not written to destroy reputations or settle scores, though the writing did, unavoidably, implicate institutions and systems and practices that had reason to prefer the silence maintained. It was written because the truth was there, and because Janet Frame had decided, at some point in the long decades of her survival and her work, that the truth was more important than any individual or institutional comfort, including her own. It was written because the women in those wards had had no voice, and because she had a voice, and because having a voice, in the circumstances, was an obligation as much as a gift. The autobiography was not an act of extraordinary courage, though it required courage. It was, more precisely, an act of necessity, the kind of necessity that a person of genuine honesty cannot ultimately refuse. Jane Campion's film extended the reach of that necessity in ways that prose alone could not. The medium of film, its capacity for faces, for the bodies of people in spaces, for the texture of light and the weight of silence, did things for Janet Frame's story that her own extraordinarily precise and beautiful writing had not been able to do, simply because film reaches audiences that literary autobiography does not. The people who watched An Angel at My Table in cinemas in London and New York and Paris, people who had never heard of Janet Frame, who knew nothing of New Zealand, who had no reason to be interested in the history of mid-century psychiatric practice in a small country at the bottom of the Pacific, these people sat in their cinema seats and felt the full weight of what had been done, and how close it had come, and what had been saved, and what had not. This was what a literary prize in a newspaper could accomplish. This was what the margin of survival looked like when someone with Campion's talent was given the materials.
And the people who watched it understood, viscerally, that the story was not just about Janet Frame. It was about every person who has ever been classified as broken when they were simply different, and what happens to them when the classification is in the hands of an institution, and the institution does not know how to be wrong. Janet Frame watched the film's reception from Dunedin with the composed satisfaction of someone who has spent their life insisting on a truth that the world was slow to hear, and who is, finally, watching the world begin to hear it. She did not seek the international spotlight. She did not travel to collect the prizes that were now offered. She continued writing in the small house in Dunedin, with the same discipline and the same rigorous attention she had brought to the work since the shed in Sargison's garden. The later years were years of something that, in Janet Frame's carefully calibrated emotional vocabulary, approached peace. Not happiness, exactly. She was too honest with herself to describe her state in those simple terms. But a settled clarity, a sense that the most important work had been done, and that the testimony had been adequately given. The country that had put her in a psychiatric ward at 20 was now celebrating her as its greatest writer. The recognition came late, and it came without the formal institutional acknowledgement that might have made it feel like genuine reckoning. But it came. She remained privately faithful to the other women, the ones whose names she had carried since the 1940s, the ones for whom no newspaper had arrived. She carried them in the texture of everything she wrote, not as characters, but as presences, as the unspoken weight that gives her prose its particular moral seriousness. She carried them into the end. On the 29th of January, 2004, in Dunedin Hospital, Janet Patterson Frame died of leukemia. She was 79 years old. The tributes that followed were genuine and substantial. Every obituary mentioned the prize. Every tribute noted the surgery that had not been performed.
Every account of her life passed through the morning in Christchurch, and the superintendent, and the newspaper, and the words, "It would not be right." And in every account, the same silence. No institution, no acknowledgement, no accounting. The signed form, still in its archive. The files, still closed. The question, still unanswered.
The tin-roofed shed in Frank Sargison's garden in Takapuna is gone now. The great stone buildings of Seacliff Asylum have been demolished, their limestone used for other purposes. The forms and the files and the institutional records are preserved in archives with the careful attention that professional preservation requires. Temperature-controlled rooms, acid-free folders, the whole elaborate machinery of institutional memory that protects the documents from the decay that claims everything else. The books remain. They will remain. And in them the question remains, on every page, in every sentence, in the precise and undeflectable quality of the attention that produced them. How many others were in those wards who should not have been there? And who is counting them now? The question of what New Zealand owed Janet Frame, and what it owed more broadly to all the people who had passed through its psychiatric system in those mid-century decades, was one that the country was unable to properly ask, let alone answer, for a very long time. The reason had nothing to do with indifference, or not primarily. It had to do with the nature of institutional acknowledgement and the immense difficulty of a system admitting, formally and publicly, that it had done harm. The institutions involved in Janet Frame's story were not, for the most part, institutions run by people who considered themselves capable of doing harm. The doctors who signed the forms and administered the treatments were operating in good faith within a professional consensus that they had been trained to trust and had no obvious reason to question. The nurses who held patients down for electroconvulsive sessions were following protocols established by the people who had trained them. The administrators who maintained the files were doing the work of administration as it had been defined for them. At every level of the system, the people involved understood themselves to be doing something helpful, or at minimum, necessary. This is what makes institutional harm so difficult to acknowledge. Individual malice is comparatively easy to identify, assign, and condemn. But the harm done by an institution operating in good faith error is distributed across so many individuals, so many ordinary professional decisions, so many unremarkable moments of institutional routine that it resists the clear attribution that accountability requires. Who is responsible?
The doctor who wrote schizophrenia in the file in 1945? The administrators who maintained the system that gave him the categories to write in? The government that funded the institution? The profession that had trained the doctor? The society that had decided, collectively and over many generations, that certain kinds of difference were disorders rather than variations? Janet Frame's autobiography does not answer this question, because the question does not have a clean answer. What the autobiography does is something more demanding. It refuses to allow the question to be dissolved into the comfortable generality of institutional error. It puts specific places and specific procedures and specific experiences on the record in specific language, and it holds them there with the full force of her extraordinary literary intelligence. It does not point a finger at any single person. It points with much greater precision and much greater effect at a system, at the way a system works, and at what a system does to the people it cannot accommodate. This is, finally, what makes Janet Frame's achievement so much more than a personal triumph of survival. Survival, on its own, is remarkable enough. Many people survive terrible things and carry those experiences in private, managing them as best they can, without making their survival available to the world in any form. Janet Frame did something different. She took the material of her survival, the diagnoses, the treatments, the locked wards, the signed form, and she converted it into literature. She converted it into a form that could be held in the hands of anyone who cared to pick it up and read it, and that could produce in those readers an understanding of things they had not experienced and might never experience, but that were real and that mattered, and that were still happening in various forms and in various places, to people who did not have the extraordinary combination of talent and luck that had saved Janet Frame's brain on that particular morning in Christchurch, that first morning in Christtown. The first readers of Faces in the Water in 1961 were people who had no direct knowledge of what a New Zealand psychiatric ward looked like, or felt like, or smelled like in the 1940s. They knew it from her book. The people who watched An Angel at My Table in cinemas in 1990 had no direct knowledge of what it felt like to be 20 years old and admitted to Seacliff Asylum with a diagnosis entered into a file in less time than it takes to read this sentence. They understood it from the film, and the understanding produced in them was not abstract, not the mild, distanced sympathy produced by a news item or a statistic. It was the understanding produced by great literature, the sense of having been inside a specific human experience, of having felt its texture and its weight, of knowing it from the inside rather than merely knowing about it. This is what literature is for, and this is what Janet Frame used it for, with absolute consistency and absolute clarity for the 50 years of her productive life. The women who had been in those wards with her, and who did not have the literary talent or the extraordinary luck to convert their experience into the form that could be held and transmitted, these women received a different kind of legacy from Janet Frame's survival. Not the literary recognition, which was not theirs to receive, but something more private and more fundamental. The knowledge, available to any of them who read her books, that someone had been in those wards with them, had seen what they had seen, and had put it on the record. That the record existed, that the experience had not been invisible, even if they individually remained so. This is perhaps the most important thing a writer can do: make visible what the world prefers not to see, and make it visible in a form that cannot be conveniently dismissed or overlooked. Janet Frame did this. She did it with the whole force of her intelligence and the whole weight of her experience. She did it from the shed in Sargison's garden, and from the rented rooms in London, and from the small houses in Dunedin where she lived and worked and maintained against all the pressure the world had brought to bear against it, the interior life that the institution had tried to manage and the surgical form had tried to end. The signed form is in its archive. The limestone of Seacliff has been used for other purposes. The tin-roofed shed is gone. But consider for a moment the morning in Christchurch. The ward, the prepared instruments, the signed form, the administrative routine proceeding with its ordinary institutional efficiency.
And then the newspaper arriving, as newspapers arrive every morning, carrying the small announcement of a literary prize, and a superintendent setting down his coffee and reading the announcement and walking to the ward. Consider the distance between those two outcomes, between the ward where the instruments were prepared and the ward where the superintendent walked to say that it would not be right. Consider that the distance was measured in column inches, in the space of a small news item, in the chance that a person in a position of authority read a newspaper before he did anything else that morning. This is the story of Janet Frame. Not the triumph. The triumph came later, and it was real, and it was earned by decades of extraordinary work done in extraordinary circumstances. But the foundation of the triumph: a morning in Christchurch, a newspaper, and the words, "It would not be right." Those words saved everything. And the question of what was not saved, the women for whom those words were never spoken, for whom the morning passed with its institutional routine intact, for whom no newspaper arrived and no superintendent walked to the ward, that question is the one Janet Frame spent her life putting on the record. She answered it with everything she wrote. She is still answering it now, on every page that carries her name. There are photographs of Janet Frame from different periods of her life that tell their own story about what the institutional years did and did not do to her. The earliest ones, from before the 1940s, show a young woman with an expression that is difficult to read, watchful, slightly removed from whatever social occasion the photograph was recording, the eyes doing something that the rest of the face is not participating in. In the photographs from after her return from Europe, after Owls Do Cry and Faces in the Water and the international recognition, there was something different in the face. Not a relaxation, exactly, but a kind of settled authority. The authority of someone who has decided who she is and does not expect a world to challenge that decision successfully. The photographs from her later life, the ones taken for literary events, the honorary degree ceremonies, the rare interviews she consented to, show a woman who is simultaneously completely present and completely contained.
She has the particular quality of very serious writers who have spent most of their lives alone. The quality of someone whose attention is always, at some level, elsewhere. Not absent, but focused on a different object than the photographer or the interviewer can see. She is looking at something they cannot look at.
She is always, still, taking notes. The face in those later photographs does not show what the institution took. What it took was not visible in a face, or at least not to a camera. What it took was time. 8 years of time, at the most critical period of a writing life. The years of early 20s and late 20s, when a writer is developing the voice and the discipline and the confidence that will sustain the work for the next 50 years. What the institution gave her instead of those years was something that no other writer who produced work of comparable quality was required to receive. A complete and systematic education in what institutions do to the people they cannot understand, conducted from the inside, at the cost of everything ordinary that those years might otherwise have contained. She never married. She had relationships, in England and in New Zealand, with people who understood something of who she was and what her work required. But the intimacy that most people take as the foundation of adult life, the continuous domestic presence of another person, the shared dailiness, was not something she ever built. The institutional years had made her exquisitely attuned to the cost of social performance, and the cost of the continuous performance that intimacy requires was, for Janet Frame, too high. She chose the writing. She chose the solitude that the writing required. She chose the shed in Sargison's garden, and then the rented rooms abroad, and then the small houses in various New Zealand towns, and eventually the house in Dunedin where she stayed until the end. This was not, she insisted, in the ways that writers insert their insistences, a deprivation. It was a construction. The solitude was not something that happened to her. It was something she built, deliberately and with full understanding of what she was building, because she understood that the work required it, and the work was what mattered. The work was, in the end, the only adequate response to what had happened to her and to the women in those wards around her. More adequate than any legal action, which she never pursued.
More adequate than any public campaign, which she never organized. More adequate than any form of institutional advocacy, which she never attempted. The work was the response. The 12 novels and the autobiography and the poetry were the testimony. And the testimony, she had decided, was enough. It had to be enough. It was all she had to offer that the institution could not administer a treatment for. The literary prizes that accumulated over the course of her career were, in one sense, simply the acknowledgement of what the work was. The Commonwealth Prize, received in 1989. The honorary degrees from the Universities of New Zealand. The Companion of the New Zealand Order of Merit, presented in a ceremony at Government House by the Governor-General. She attended these events with the composed and slightly remote quality she brought to all public occasions, accepting the acknowledgement with a grace that gave nothing away about what she thought of the country that was now honoring what it had once very nearly destroyed. What she thought, if she ever articulated it to the people closest to her, was not recorded. She was not a person who spoke often or directly about the institutional years in conversation. The writing had been the speaking. In conversation, she turned the subject elsewhere, toward the work of the people she admired, toward questions of craft and attention, and the particular demands of sustained literary endeavor. She was generous with her intelligence in these conversations, and precise, and occasionally very funny in the dry and understated mode of someone who has observed enough of the world's arrangements to find them both deplorable and absurd. Frank Sargison died in 1982. By then, the shed in his garden had long been demolished, and Janet Frame was well into the period of the autobiography, and the relationship between them had evolved, as the relationships between serious writers of different generations sometimes do, into something more complicated than the simple rescue narrative that the 1955 story might suggest. Sargison had given her the shed and the time and the quiet. He had also, in ways that Janet Frame discussed with characteristic obliqueness in her autobiography, represented a kind of literary authority that she had had to learn to trust on her own terms rather than his.
The education in solitude and self-direction that the shed had initiated required at some point the departure from the shed and from Sargison's vicinity, required the voyage to England, the distance from New Zealand entirely, the years of learning to be a writer in the world without the protective structure of his garden and his attention. She acknowledged this in the autobiography with the precision and the fairness that she brought to all her human assessments. He had given her what she needed at the moment when she needed it. She had eventually needed something else, and she had gone to find it. Charles Brosh, who had first seen the manuscript of The Lagoon and arranged its publication, and submitted it for the prize that cancelled the surgery, died in 1973. He had spent the years between in the quiet and serious work of editing Landfall and maintaining the literary conversation that he considered his primary obligation to New Zealand culture. He had known in those years that what he had done in 1951, the quiet, practical action of passing a manuscript from a hospital patient to a publisher, had been one of the most consequential editorial decisions in the history of New Zealand literature. He did not, by all accounts, regard it in those terms. He regarded it as doing what was obvious, given what was in the manuscript. The manuscript was extraordinary. Therefore, the manuscript should be published. The subsequent history was simply the consequence of the manuscript being what it was. This is, in its way, the most useful version of the story. Not the story of a dramatic rescue, though the drama was real. Not the story of an institution finally recognizing what it was destroying, though the recognition, however accidental, however narrow its margin, was real. But the story of a manuscript, and what a manuscript can do when the right eyes find it at the right moment, and of the systems, the literary ones, not the psychiatric ones, that at their best exist precisely to ensure that the right eyes do find it. The Lagoon is still in print. Faces in the Water is still in print. The autobiography, in its 3 volumes and in the single-volume edition that appeared later, is still in print. Students in New Zealand secondary schools read Janet Frame. Critics in the major literary journals of the English-speaking world write about her work with the seriousness reserved for canonical figures.
The film is still watched by people who encounter it for the first time and respond to it with the urgency that great documentary art produces, the sense that this is something that happened, not a story someone invented, and that the happening matters. All of this is the consequence of the morning in Christchurch. All of it flows from the newspaper and the prize and the words "it would not be right." And all of it stands as the permanent answer to the question that the institution, in signing the form and preparing the operating room, was asking without knowing it was asking. What is this person worth? What is the interior life of a poet worth, measured against the administrative convenience of an institution that cannot accommodate it? What is the full and particular and irreplaceable selfhood of a woman who sees the world differently from the people around her worth when placed on a scale against the professional consensus of a medical establishment that has decided she is broken? The books answer the question. They have been answering it for over 60 years. They will go on answering it for as long as they are read. And the women who had no books, who received the full measure of the institution's answer, in the treatment room and in the operating wing, without the intervention of any newspaper, they are answered by the books too. Not by name, because the names are not recorded, but in the texture of every page that Janet Frame produced, they are present. Their presence is the weight that makes the books as heavy as they are. Their silence is what gives her testimony its particular and unappeasable urgency. She is still answering it now, on every page that carries her name. She will be answering it long after the archive that holds the signed form has been reorganized, and the boxes have been moved to different shelves, and the temperature in the preservation room has been adjusted by a degree or two in response to updated climate data. The books will outlast the archive. The testimony will outlast the record. How many others were in those wards who should not have been there? And who is counting them now? Janet Frame is counting them. She has been counting them since 1945. Every page she wrote is one more number in that count, and the count is not finished.